a lifetime of sexual abuse. He molested all 3 of the boys, stabbed them both to death. I believe he snapped. There was so much the jury never got to hear. No, I don't think he should spend the rest of his life in prison. And this is why. How old were you when you met David?
When I met David, I was 13. I was just about to turn 14. David was very much into grades, math, science, soccer, but he was kind of like one of the guys that, like a chess club kid, almost. When me and my brother were kind of aggressive, kind of rough kids, and David hung around with kids when I first met him and first got to junior high. He hung around with kids that met up after school to play Risk and board games and stuff. He wasn't like me and my brother, kind of like me and my brother at all. He was very academic. That's the word I was looking for. David was very academic and always wanting to learn things. And the guys that he hung around with were kind of like those kind of kids, kind of like booky, kind of nerdy kids. So David was that kind of kid. He was kind of like a book smart kind of a dork. But there was another side to him too that those guys didn't have that David did have, and it was just a complete athletic drive, very sportsman-like, very much of kind of like a jock, but he didn't come across like that. He just was that.
Was he a nice kid?
Oh gosh, yeah. David was a very nice kid, very withdrawn. So he was nice to you on the surface because that's just the way David acted, but he didn't really go out of his way to make new friends or meet new people. He was nice enough to just get through the pleasantries of having to come into contact with another human being, and then he'd rather kind of move on, you know what I mean? If he didn't know you that well.
So then at what point did you and David become really good friends, because he still refers to you as his best friend?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was in 8th grade, and we were on the same team in school. They had you separated into colored teams, team red, team orange, team blue, team white, or whatever, just a way to kind of split the kids up and into different groups. So we were on the same team, which meant you had, if you were on orange team, you had the same math class, in 5th hour, and you had the same science class. So that put me around David a lot. And we both loved baseball. We both loved soccer. We both loved playing sports. I don't know. I was just drawn to David because, for one, me and my brother definitely were kind of ruffians, and we didn't like seeing kids get picked on. And David got into a lot of fights. A lot of kids picked on David, or tried to pick on David, and David would fight a lot, but a lot of times he was outnumbered, or he was kind of the odd man out in that situation. So I automatically liked him because of that, because he was kind of like an underdog, and he stuck up for himself. He fought for himself.
So it sounds like he didn't instigate fights, but he didn't allow people to just take advantage and beat on him either.
Yeah, that's right. He never, ever instigated fights. Me and my brother and some of the other guys we hung around with did, but David didn't do that.
Do you remember the first time that you met John?
Yeah. I remember the first time that I saw. It's really weird. I never actually was formally introduced to John like that. Hi, I'm David's dad, or David saying, hey, this is my dad, John, or David never said, hey, this is my friend Jason. It's just, when you're that age, it was kind of weird. It's I would call the house a lot to ask for David, and he would answer the phone and be like, David, telephone. But so by the time the first time I saw John, he had already knew we were friends with David, just because we were one of the boys that were calling to the house, or David would call over to our house, or David would tell John, I'm going to hang out with Jason and Mike. So we were friends for a whole year before I saw John, but John knew who we were. He knew, and there was plenty of times where I saw John and John saw me, and we were over at the house, but never, I mean, I never ever got into a dialogue with that man beyond, hi, how are you doing, Mr. Barnett? Or is David home? Or can David come out and play? You know, it was more like that. I never ever like sat down with him and had dinner like over at David's house with them. Neither did any other kids. I mean, it's just not the way it was. David and the boys had their little back section of the house that they were kind of cordoned off to, and John was up in the living room and in the main part of the house, and you just didn't go in there. And not just us, but David and Eric and Chris, they just didn't go in there. It was just, and John didn't want him in there. You know, he wanted him kind of in that back room. So, but I guess the first time I met John or saw John was probably 4 or 5 months after we had met David.
Did you get any kind of weird vibes from him right away? Any vibes like this guy is, not nice or?
Well, the vibes that I got from him were that it was just weird. It was like he didn't really give a shit about the kids. It was like he wanted them. For one, there was never any food in the house. There was never any food in their refrigerator or their cupboards or anything like that. Like, I remember like a cheap, shitty like Red Baron or a Tombstone frozen pizza was like lobster to those kids if there was like a frozen pizza in the freezer. So we didn't keep food around the house. He didn't want them in the main part of the house. He wanted them in the back part of the house. So the first thing I think I realized was like, wow, this is kind of weird. Like, this guy doesn't want like anything to do with his kids, or he doesn't want them in the main part of the house with him, and then just the fact that right away they loved coming over to our house to eat. David, sometimes he'd bring Eric, but like when we would meet up, they were always hungry. They were always wanting something to eat. And that's where like a lot of David and the boys' diet was like scrounging up change or getting, a few bucks together and going up and buying like Doritos and sodas at the 7-Eleven down the street. Like, they ate at 7-Eleven more than they ate with John and at home.
So it certainly wasn't a family dynamic.
No, not at all.
Do you remember, I know David in his book was talking about how no matter how good he did at soccer, and he was pretty much one of the stars of his team, John, it was just never enough for him. He just, never said, I'm proud of you, never said good job, never said anything like that. And it was always like either getting smacked upside his head with a ring because he didn't get that one shot, that one goal, or just he wouldn't say anything to him at all. Do you remember witnessing any of that?
I knew that from Eric and David and Chris telling me that. And Todd, one of our friends at school, was on that same soccer team, and he would tell me the stories about John just flipping out, on David, because Todd would ride home after their soccer matches and soccer practice and everything, would ride home. John would drop Todd off. So Todd would hear and see that stuff in the car. By the time I came along and me and David started playing baseball together, I just didn't understand those stories because John was never, ever, ever at one baseball game that we had that me and David were on together. My mom would drive David and me to baseball practice. John never came to the games. He never showed interest in David. So obviously there had already been a break between David and John by the time we had started playing baseball, because it was completely the opposite. Instead of him being there and being on David's case about how he was playing and really interested and and David being on the team and all this, he just didn't care. He was never ever there. He had already moved his focus to Eric. John did, basically. David was already kind of past the age, I guess, that to John's liking.
You were friends with David when he lit himself on fire, and you went up to see him, obviously at the hospital. And
yes.
David, that I can't even imagine seeing my best friend like that. That would be horrific. And he says that John, the only thing that he really cared about was that he didn't fall behind with his homework.
Yeah, I remember actually being in school and having the teacher talk to us about what had happened to David. They were asking if any kids in school wanted counseling and stuff, because the whole school had known about it once it had happened. And I remember like teachers getting together homework, whatever we were doing in school, David, they were getting David like packets together, to send to the hospital. And then, so David, because I know that was very, very important to David. He was very curriculum driven. Like, he cared about grades. He cared about what the teachers thought of him. He cared about doing good on tests. Those were the things that David cared about. He didn't really seem to care about a lot of, at that age, like acceptance. Like, it didn't seem like, although later I would find out, other things, but it just didn't seem like he cared what students thought of him or what his peers thought of him. It was all about what adults thought of him, what the teacher thought of him. Did it come across in his grades? He wanted to be one of the smartest kids because he studied hard, and that was just his that was his drive when we first started hanging around. That's all he cared about was grades, doing good in school. And a lot of that was expectations of John, but I think a lot of that was David himself, just eager to learn.
Even in his 25 years that he's been at Potosi, he still has that same drive to learn. He's literally taken every single course that is offered to an inmate there.
Every class.
Every single one. So he's, in that way, he's still the same as he was back then, right?
Oh yeah, David has a brilliant mind, and he's just a huge sponge. He loves soaking up information, even if it's where I was like, oh, if I'm interested in it, then I want to know about it. But if it's not something I'm interested in, I could care less.
Me too.
David was not like that. He was like, even if this doesn't interest me, I want to know everything about it. That way I could truly rule it out as something that doesn't interest me. Like, it was just like that. Or he would want the knowledge just so he could have a conversation with someone about it, whether it be a teacher or whether it be like a study partner or something like that. Like, it was just that he loved that stuff.
Other people that I've talked to have said that, David is just one of the kindest people that would do anything in the world for anyone. What is your experience as his best friend like in that way?
Oh, absolutely. There were times when, like, especially where, we were pretty violent at that age, not David, but me and my brother and a few other guys. And there was a lot of times where we would be fighting, and David would be the guy to step in and be like, stop, you're hurting him. Stop, get off him. Stop, leave him alone. Even when it was his own friends, us, getting out of line. David would bring us back in a lot of times, and just, so yeah, David was very, very much, had a very good heart and a very good conscience, and just did not have the violent streak that we had. David was one of the kindest friends I've ever had, and just, I would never imagine that David would have any kind of violence in him.
When did you find out about what was going on at his house?
It was the summer right after 8th grade. I started noticing things like there was like when the street lights came on and it got dark in the neighborhood, my parents I had to get home, or I'd be in trouble. David could be out till like 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and it seemed like nobody gave a shit, and I'm like, man, it's dark and it's a school night and it's like 9:30. How are you still over here hanging out without like calling your dad to find out, if it's okay? Or he would show up on school nights like real late, like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, like throwing little pebbles at me and Mike's window or trying to wake me and Mike up. And he would be scared. And it would be like, what's going on? And he'd be like, oh, and there's, my dad beat me up. And I ran out of the house. And, so some stuff like that started to happen. Things started happening with Eric. David was fighting with John a lot. And I now know, looking back and finding everything out, of course, later on in life, that, John would be doing things to Eric, and David preemptively almost, knowing that what was going to happen, would like maybe start some shit, start a fight with John, do something, maybe drop something, maybe break something to create some kind of drama to where John's focus wouldn't be on Eric.
Right.
basically. So we started kind of noticing that stuff. Like he was always getting in trouble with John, and it was always, this stuff. And we're like, well, what's going on? And then finally, me and David had a heart-to-heart talk at Larson Park. That summer, basically, was when it all came out. Was when David told me and Mike, and told us everything that had been going on, and told us that it had ever been. Basically, it started by him saying everything was going on with Eric, because David wouldn't at first outrightly admit that this had happened to him. It was almost like a very shameful thing, and it was
Mm.
like, this is happening to Eric,
Yeah.
and one time at Larson Park, I had asked David if he had ever thought any of this stuff had ever happened to him. And this is a well documented story, and I think it was in the court in testimony. But that day when I asked David if that, well, do you think any of this stuff that's happening to Eric has ever happened to you? David just completely lost it and flipped out and attacked me.
So he didn't attack. He didn't freak out and start crying. He lashed out
Oh, he
because he was embarrassed. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's the thing. He attacked me, and he had physically attacked me when I had said that. When I said, "Do you think this had ever happened to you?" He physically attacked me. But the thing was, when we had always kind of wrestled and fought and just a teenage rivalry. But even though we were best friends, it was always like we're wrestling around and so he was gonna be tougher, things like that. We had already done that before, and we always did that with each other. This was different when he attacked me this time. This was because he was crying. Like when he was punching me and when we were wrestling around and got me down on the ground and he was on top of me punching me, he was crying at the same time. So
My God.
that right there was like, I was like, holy shit, what the hell's going on here? Like, and I was young and I didn't know that there was a lot of things going on there. But when
That's
he had
heartbreaking.
stopped punching me and he got up and he started to walk away and was going to go home, he was still crying, and he turned to me and he said, I know it did. So there was a lot of time in between the question and the answer, and a lot of stuff that happened in between my question and his answer. So when he was walking away from me and crying, that's when he said, I know it did, and he ran home. For like 2 weeks after that, the first few weeks, few months, I knew that it was going on with Eric. I just did. And it was almost like we would meet up and huddle up and what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Eric, poor little Eric, but I never did I think that was going on with David until that day happened. And when after that day, for like 2 weeks after that, every time me and David would be around each other, he acted very like macho, like very, like lots of almost like, and looking back, I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I know why he was acting all macho and stuff, because he knew that I knew, and it was like at that age, I don't want my friends to think I'm gay or weird. But once he saw that I truly loved him and was not going to judge him and still was his best friend, he dropped that macho stuff like after a few weeks. I think it was just like a defense mechanism, like, see, I'm tough, see, I'm not gay, you know what I mean? And it was like, once he saw that, like, I didn't really care about that, I was more interested in him as a person, not like what had happened to him, but like he was my friend, and what, I wanted to keep moving forward with him as my friend, and that was, I definitely had ways of relaying that to him, like I would invite him places, everywhere I went, I took him, and when I went to go meet these girls that I hung around with, I always took Dave. So he kind of realized that and dropped the macho stuff, but that spoke volumes, when he started acting all macho and stuff like that after that happened. That told me a lot.
Yeah, that's very sad. Like you've painted a picture in my mind, like, and I'm just imagining what that scene would have looked like, and that's just heartbreaking. I've got goosebumps everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much stuff like that was going on in his life at the time that it's just. I think one thing that I love about David is that even though he had kind of been through that, and I think he had gotten to an age where he wasn't appealing to John anymore, he
Yeah.
could have just shut up about it and grown up and just hid it all. But the fact that it was still happening and going to be happening to Eric, The fact that he would not let it go. He had something inside him that was like, I'm not going to let the same thing happen to him that happened to me. Instead of just like letting it happen to Eric and being like, all right, screw it, it's not me anymore. So, hey, the heat's off of my shoulders for now. And, so, you know what I mean? Definitely stepped up to the plate for Eric, or at least tried as a 14-year-old could, to step up to the plate for Eric, which the only thing he could do was put himself in between Eric and John by either, just creating some drama out of thin air, just to give Eric peace for the evening.
Jason shares so much more with us. Make sure to subscribe to Crime 411 so you don't miss out on episode 5 of the David Barnett story.